Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where we read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times. So stick around. So if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 47, in which the Lamanites principle is taught, and Amalickiah rises to power from just a mere Lamanite general to the Lamanite king himself. So the last chapter is basically Amalickiah's clawing to power. He kills Lamanites, he kills the king, he marries the queen, all through subtle sabotage manipulation. Very, I hate to say it, but satanic tactics that teaches us a lot about learning to recognize and learning to avoid and resist temptation from the devil. That is as subtle as what Amalickiah did. It is such a fascinating chapter, so much drama, so much intrigue and sabotage. Definitely worth a listen. So, now that Amalickiah is king, let's see what he does with his newfound power. So yeah, I think without further ado, let's read Alma chapter 48. And now it came to pass that as soon as Amalickiah had obtained the kingdom, he began to inspire the hearts of the Lamanites against the people of Nephi. Yea, he did appoint men to speak unto the Lamanites from their towers against the Nephites. And thus he did inspire their hearts against the Nephites, insomuch that in the latter end of the 19th year of the reign of the judges, he having accomplished his designs thus far, yea, having been made king over the Lamanites, he sought also to reign over all the land, yea, and all the people who were in the land, the Nephites as well as the Lamanites. Therefore he had accomplished his design, for he had hardened the hearts of the Lamanites and blinded their minds, and stirred them up to anger, insomuch that he had gathered together a numerous host to go to battle against the Nephites. So if you listened to last episode, you heard me talk a lot about how Amalickiah is just so power hungry. Like, usually when you get a Nephite dissenter who's really angry at the Nephites and goes to the Lamanites to use the Lamanites to attack the Nephites, usually they're satisfied with being just a Lamanite general and having that power. But Amalickiah, not only does he want to be a Lamanite general, not only does he want to be a Lamanite king, but he wants to be king over all the land. He is still not done clawing for power, and he is literally the Lamanite king. It took him one chapter to go from a Lamanite general to the Lamanite king. And now, the reason that he's attacking the Nephites isn't because he hates them. I mean, I'm sure it is too, but it's mostly because he wants to conquer them. He wants to be an emperor of the entire area where the Nephites and the Lamanites live. So he is still not done. His greed knows no bounds. And also what's interesting is in verse 1, it talks about how he kind of uses propaganda to mold the thoughts of the Lamanites against the Nephites. He says that he inspired the hearts of the Lamanites against the Nephites. Again, this is in verse 1. He says, he did appoint men to speak unto the Lamanites from their towers against the Nephites. So he has people just like in the public square proclaiming hate against the Nephites. He is using pure and simple propaganda, and it is working. He is riling these people up to get angry at the Nephites. And if you remember what I mentioned last chapter, he appeals to emotion a lot. Like when he had his servants kill the king, and he pretended to be mad about it, he was like, if you loved the king, you would go chase his assailants. Which, again, is an appeal to emotion. He's trying to get the people mad at the people who killed the king that they so loved. And he's doing the same thing here. He's using, I'm sure, very fiery speech to increase the Lamanites' anger and make them less reasonable. And it is working. So now that the Lamanites are properly propagandized and radicalized, you might even say, against the Nephites, let's see what happens when those angry Lamanites actually go and attack the Nephites. For he was determined, because of the greatness of the number of his people, to overpower the Nephites and bring them into bondage. And thus he did appoint chief captains of the Zoramites, they being the most acquainted with the strength of the Nephites, and their places of resort, and the weakest parts of their cities. Therefore he appointed them to be chief captains over his armies. And it came to pass that they took their camp, and moved forth toward the land of Zarahemla in the wilderness. So briefly, I want to mention how in verse 5 it mentions that Amalickiah appointed Zoramites to be the generals of his army. Not only because it says in the verse that they were most acquainted with the strength of the Nephites and their weaknesses, etc., but also, in my opinion, he appointed Zoramites because they hate the Nephites the most. It's been mentioned in multiple chapters, including last chapter, that Nephite dissenters often hate the Nephites more than the Lamanites themselves do. And so it only makes sense to place hateful Nephite dissenters as the generals of their army. Because, again, they have the most hate, they have the most passion against the Nephites. So not only are they the most familiar with them, their strengths, their weaknesses, their strategies, etc., but they also hate them the most. What a strategy. Now it came to pass that while Amalickiah had thus been obtaining power by fraud and deceit, Moroni, on the other hand, had been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord their God. Yea, he had been strengthening the armies of the Nephites, and erecting small forts or places of resort, throwing up banks of earth round about to enclose his armies, and also building walls of stone to encircle them about, round about their cities and the borders of their lands, yea, all round about the land. And in their weakest fortifications he did place the greater number of men, and thus he did fortify and strengthen the land which was possessed by the Nephites. And thus he was preparing to support their liberty, their lands, their wives and their children, and their peace, and that they might live unto the Lord their God, and that they might maintain that which was called by their enemies the cause of Christians. And Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. He was a man of a perfect understanding, yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country, and his brethren from bondage and slavery. Yea, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings which he bestowed upon his people, a man who did labor exceedingly for the welfare and safety of his people. Yea, and he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, and his country, and his religion, even unto the loss of blood. So, now we kind of shift from Amalickiah back to Captain Moroni among the Nephites. I actually love verse 7 because it very smoothly transitions between the strategies of Amalickiah to Moroni. It very effectively kind of juxtaposes them and contrasts them. Because in verse 7 it says, while Amalickiah had thus been obtaining power by fraud and deceit, talking about how Amalickiah is lying to everyone around him to get power, Moroni, on the other hand, it says, has been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful. And so Amalickiah is focusing on lying and manipulating and fraud to get power. Moroni is not even looking for power. He is just preparing the minds of his people to be faithful. And that is one of his defenses against the coming Lamanites. I actually have the end of that verse highlighted, marking it as faith. And then the next two verses, verses 8 and 9, where the fortifications that Captain Moroni is erecting are described. I marked those two verses as works. So not only is Moroni preparing the faith of his people by teaching them the word of God, but also he's physically preparing the people by spreading out his armies in ways that are effective and fortifying the cities in ways that are effective. So he is not only relying on faith, and he is not only relying on works. As I've said in previous chapters, Captain Moroni is someone who does both. He's a very effective duelist, and I think that is why he's such an effective leader. While all Amalickiah is doing is getting his people angry against the Nephites, Moroni is thoughtfully preparing not only the minds, but the cities of the Nephites, so that every part of them is prepared to face the Lamanites. And then, oh, I love these verses. Verses 11 to 13 talks about who Moroni was as a person. It kind of lists some of his values and some of his attributes. It talks about how he's a strong and a mighty man, and a man of perfect understanding. In verse 12, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God. And also in verse 13, he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn an oath to defend his people. And so I believe these verses are included by Mormon because Mormon loves Captain Moroni. Why do you think Mormon named his own son after Moroni? Like, clearly, he really, really likes this guy. Because I think mostly of the things that I've mentioned. He's a dualist. He can do both faith and works. He's a man of great faith and devotion to God and trust in his plan. But also, he prepares effectively and strategizes with a clear mind. Anyways, Moroni's awesome. Lecture over. I love him. Now, the Nephites were taught to defend themselves against their enemies, even to the shedding of blood if it were necessary. Yea, and they were also taught never to give an offense. Yea, and never to raise the sword except it were against an enemy, except it were to preserve their lives. And this was their faith, that by doing so God would prosper them in the land. Or in other words, if they were faithful in keeping the commandments of God, that he would prosper them in the land, yea, warn them to flee or to prepare for war according to their danger. And also that God would make it known unto them whither they should go to defend themselves against their enemies, and by so doing the Lord would deliver them. And this was the faith of Moroni, and his heart did glory in it, not in the shedding of blood, but in doing good, in preserving his people, yea, in keeping the commandments of God, yea, and resisting iniquity. Yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been, and were, and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. Oh my goodness, verse 17 is another Mormon fanboy verse for Captain Moroni, which I'm not opposed to. I love a good Captain Moroni fanboy because I'm in fact one of them myself. I love Captain Moroni, and I love how it's worded in verse 17. If all men had been, and were, and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. My gosh. What a man. Oh my goodness. He is such a cool dude. But I also want to point out a couple things. In verse 14, it talks about how the Nephites as a whole are taught to never raise the sword, this says in verse 14 at the end, except it were against an enemy, except it were to preserve their lives. So the Nephites are strict self-defenders, and that is it. Any offense that they do is in fact for defense. If you remember a couple of chapters ago, Moroni took some armies and actually chased the Amalickiahites into the wilderness to stop them from getting to the Lamanites. Moroni knew that Amalickiah would do bad things if he got among the Lamanites, which in fact did happen, because the very next chapter was the one in which he became their king. So, anyways, anything that Captain Moroni does is in self-defense. Another point that I want to bring up that I actually found really interesting is in verses 15 and 16. So if you've read the Book of Mormon very much, you've probably found the phrase, if you keep the commandments, you'll prosper in the land. That comes from Lehi, so it actually has been among the Nephites for a very, very long time, this phrase, this promise from God, that if you keep the commandments, you'll be prospered. If you don't, you won't be. And what's interesting is how these Nephites view prospering and view deliverance from God. Because many people think, well, if God delivers them, he does it in some miraculous way. Or if God makes sure that they prosper in the land, again, he uses some sort of miraculous force to keep the forces of evil at bay so that they can stay prosperous. But in these verses, it talks about how God, in verse 15, it says, he warns them to flee, or he warns them to prepare for war, according to their danger. And so God doesn't just remove all evil from their life, but he prepares them for it, and that is how he makes sure that they remain prosperous. Also in verse 16, it talks about how God will make it known unto them whither they should go to defend themselves against their enemies, and by so doing, the Lord would deliver them. And so deliverance isn't seen as a miraculous thing. It's seen as guidance from God to help them defend themselves. Because that means that these Nephites understood that God does not solve all of their problems for them. God provides them the opportunities and the resources and the understanding to do it themselves. Isn't that cool? When you think of things in the modern day like prosperity gospel, basically the idea is in some very weird Protestant circles, prosperity gospel is basically if you have enough faith, God will give you money. God will make sure that you are prosperous, as they say. But in these Nephites' idea, that is not how it would work at all. They are prospered by God warning them and protecting them and guiding them in their own defense. Isn't that cool? They don't see God as just someone who can snap his fingers and just make everything happen, even though he could, but he doesn't. Because he wants to build his children's character. He wants us to learn and to grow and to use our agency ourselves. If God just deleted all opposition against the Nephites, instead of helping them help themselves, the Nephites wouldn't grow. They wouldn't learn. They wouldn't fight for their own rights. They wouldn't fight, as the title of Liberty says, for God and religion and family. Oh, this is so cool. I never thought about this before, but the way that these Nephites talk about deliverance and being prosperous as a gift from God is so different than a lot of people think of it today. Behold, he was a man like unto Ammon, the son of Mosiah, yea, and even the other sons of Mosiah, yea, and also Alma and his sons, for they were all men of God. Now behold, Helaman and his brethren were no less serviceable unto the people than was Moroni, for they did preach the word of God. And they did baptize unto repentance all men whosoever would hearken unto their words. And they went forth, and the people did humble themselves because of their words, insomuch that they were highly favored of the Lord. And thus they were free from wars and contentions among themselves, yea, even for the space of 4 years. But, as I have said, in the latter end of the 19th year, yea, notwithstanding their peace amongst themselves, they were compelled reluctantly to contend with their brethren the Lamanites. Yea, and in fine, their wars never did cease for the space of many years with the Lamanites, notwithstanding their much reluctance. Now they were sorry to take up arms against the Lamanites, because they did not delight in the shedding of blood. Yea, and this was not all. They were sorry to be the means of sending so many of their brethren out of this world into an eternal world, unprepared to meet their God. Nevertheless, they could not suffer to lay down their lives, that their wives and their children should be massacred by the barbarous cruelty of those who were once their brethren, yea, and had dissented from their church, and had left them, and had gone to destroy them by joining the Lamanites. Yea, they could not bear that their brethren should rejoice over the blood of the Nephites, so long as there were any who should keep the commandments of God, for the promise of the Lord was, if they should keep his commandments, they should prosper in the land. So these last few verses are beautiful to me, because it talks about how the Nephites are reluctant to fight the Lamanites, but they are forced to, because otherwise, as it says in verse 24, their wives and their children should be massacred by the barbarous cruelty of those who were once their brethren. I love that phrase, those who were once their brethren, because it looks at the wicked Nephite dissenters who, as we've mentioned many times, hate the Nephites the most, and they go, "You were once our brethren. What happened? We were once family. And now, because of this dissension, there is this horrible conflict between us." I just love that, even just by the language in these verses, they're kind of reaching out to their Lamanite brethren, and they're being like, "We don't want to fight you. You are our brethren." And in some cases, the Nephite dissenters, they were literally once their brethren. And yet, now, the Lamanites have, as it says again in verse 24, barbarous cruelty against the Nephites. And it says multiple times in verse 22 and 23 that they are reluctant to kill the Lamanites. They don't delight in the shedding of blood. And I also love the phrase at the end of verse 23, they are sending so many of their brethren out of this world into an eternal world, unprepared to meet their God. As we've mentioned in previous chapters, one of the very purposes of this life itself is to prepare to meet God. By killing the Lamanites, the Nephites are cutting their chance short to learn about God and to come closer to him and to prepare to meet him. And I can't imagine how awful that must feel, to kill someone who you know is not ready. But at the very least, with modern revelation, we understand that there is a spirit prison and a spirit world where people can still be converted, people can still be preached to, and they can still have that chance even after their death. But anyways, I just love the phrasing of like, oh, they're sending people unprepared to meet God to their deaths. But that very wording tells me how much these Nephites care about the souls of these Lamanites. Even though these Lamanites hate them, in fact, unreasonably so, the Nephites are still like, hey, you were once our brethren, and we care about your preparedness to meet God. And it is only because you would kill us otherwise that we kill you. We are sorry, we are reluctant to do this. We do not delight in the shedding of blood, but you're forcing our hand. So that kind of paints the entirety of the war chapters as one massive tragedy. Because again, the Nephites are being forced to kill people that they don't want to kill, that were once their brethren, that are being sent to an eternal world unprepared to meet their God. But all in all, this is a fascinating chapter, very much a Captain Moroni fanboy chapter, I will say. But again, I won't complain, because I'm on that bus too, so there you go. But anyways, we once again see a little bit of Amalickiah's sabotage and manipulation and subtlety, and we see a little bit of Moroni's dualism, where he is both faith-focused and works-focused. He does both to prepare the people against the Lamanites. And also, my favorite part, like I mentioned in verse 15 and 16, the understanding that these Nephites have of the gift from God that is prospering and also deliverance. They don't understand it as something that God just gives them on a silver platter. They understand it as something that God helps them achieve on their own, which is so cool, and I love that point of view on this. So the standout verse for this chapter is going to be verse 7, which says, "Now it came to pass that while Amalickiah had thus been obtaining power by fraud and deceit, Moroni, on the other hand, had been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord their God." So I think it's really significant that when you're reading this transitional verse between Amalickiah and Moroni, the first thing that's talked about when it comes to Moroni's strategy is that he's preparing the minds of the people. It doesn't say, well, Amalickiah is gaining power by fraud and deceit, and Captain Moroni is fortifying his cities. It doesn't say that. It says Captain Moroni is preparing the minds of the people. That, to me, says that the preparing of the minds is the most important thing. And that is why they say it first when they start referring to Captain Moroni. And so, what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that my testimony, the faith that I have in God, is a powerful tool against the enemy, against conflict. And that has been repeated by modern-day prophets and apostles. That brings to mind the famous quote by President Nelson, where he talks about the fact that it will not be possible to survive spiritually without a testimony in the coming years. Faith in God is not an afterthought to Moroni, it is the first priority. Physical fortification, etc., comes after, once the testimonies are solidified, once people have an understanding of God and His gospel. But again, faith comes first, and so should it in our lives. That was the chapter for today. I hope you enjoyed. This was such a fascinating episode, and I really did notice things that I haven't noticed before in this chapter, and I hope you enjoyed. But yeah, there's just a few links down in the show notes I want to bring up really quickly. Firstly, there's a let me know what you learned link, so if you're going to shoot me a message and chat about something Book of Mormon related, you can go ahead and do that there, or you can DM me on Instagram, either way. Next, there are a handful of links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon, so if you don't have your own copy but you want to read along, or find a verse you like, or a book you like, or even create a study plan, you can go ahead and click those down there. Thirdly, there's a quick support the show link, so if you're going to shoot me a few dollars and support what I do, that'd be greatly appreciated. Next, we're on YouTube, so if you're going to go subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can find the podcast there twice a week, just as it is on any other platform. And yeah, so if that works for you, go ahead and subscribe there. But finally, I am on Instagram, so if you're going to go follow me there, you can find where I'm the most active, I post the most, and I post episode clips, standout verses, trivia sometimes, updates on my story, etc., etc. It's a good time. So yeah, I'll see you there. But that's all I've got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.